I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and this is the new Hiby R8 II. This is Hiby's new flagship digital audio player, and it's coming just a few months after this guy came out. This is the M300, and this is the first DAP I've ever given 5 stars to. That's another Hiby DAP. This one is a flagship, and on paper, this thing's got a lot of advantages over the M300. So how much do I like this? Well, this one might be a little bit confusing. So let's just start up. All right, this thing is, as I mentioned, a flagship, and because of that, you get flagship pricing. The R8 Mark II is $2,000. So yeah, literally 10 times the cost of the M300. And on paper, what are the differences? Well, a handful of things. So obviously the device is bigger. You get a much larger display, just more premium build materials all around. Okay, you also get a much bigger battery. This battery is like 6 times the size of the battery you get in the M300. You get more power output, which is kind of what you would expect. You of course also get balanced outputs, which the M300 doesn't have. But maybe the most interesting thing about the R8 Mark II is that it's got its own unique, what Hiby calls it Darwin MPA. It's like their own unique solution to a DAC, all right? Most digital audio players, they have kind of off-the-shelf DACs from Cirrus Logic, AKM, or ESS. This thing doesn't have any of those, all right? If you're looking for it on the spec sheet, you're not gonna find it because it doesn't have them. Instead, what this thing has is an FPGA that Hiby has programmed to operate as a DAC. And that's actually kind of interesting because, you know, I say this in a lot of my reviews of digital audio players, is that the sound differences between them are not significant. Well, this thing having a very different solution for the audio architecture, if anything is going to have a chance to sound pretty different to my ears, I would say this is in the running, right? It's got a completely different solution for the DAC. But I'll just say up front, I kind of don't get it. I don't get it. This thing's a $2,000 digital audio player. We'll talk about this. There's some good stuff about this thing, but exactly why it costs 10 times more than that, I don't know. I don't know. All right, let's dive into it. Packaging wise, okay, actually, quick shout out to Hiby, by the way, for sending this guy in for review. If you want to check out the R8 Mark II, I've got it linked down below, but let's take a quick tour of the packaging, what you get inside of it, and it is quite nice packaging. I will give it that. Very handsome R8 Mark II branding over there on the outside. And what you get inside is actually fairly sparse, but about as much as you would want. You get a USB cable for charging, and it is a C-to-C cable. There's no charging brick, so hopefully you've got a USB-C charging brick. I've got plenty of them, so that's fine for me. It's got a screen protector in the package. In fact, I had another screen protector pre-installed. I took it off because this is still just like a cheap plastic screen protector. I don't think it feels very good. If you're concerned about protecting your $2,000 investment, I can understand that. But this is a nice Corning Gorilla Glass screen, so it feels really nice to the touch and should be pretty, you know, resistant to scratches. It also comes with, and this is interesting, I've never seen this before, just these little protective sheets that you can put on the bottom and the top of this device, or maybe it's just the bottom, because this is stainless steel and it's quite shiny. I suppose it could scratch up if you're inserting headphone cables repeatedly. I didn't have those issues. Again, I'm not a big fan of covering my really nice premium materials with plastic sheets, so I personally don't use that stuff, but if you do use that stuff, it's nice that it's included in the box, although maybe it would have been nice if it was a glass screen protector. The other thing that you get inside the box, when you push this aside to make some room, is a really nice carry case, or at least it's nicely built. It is a TPU case, so it's like a soft plastic, but it's not just any soft plastic or any TPU case. It's a little bit on the thick side, which makes it feel a little extra premium. And then it's also got, as you can kind of see here on the sides, it's got Alcantara, and that's actually real branded Alcantara, which is interesting. It's like a suede material. It's a synthetic, so I don't believe it's a real leather or anything like that. It's like intentionally a synthetic material. It feels quite nice. It's soft, maybe picks up a little bit of lint, but generally is a material I like a lot. Now, that said, I don't love this case for a couple of reasons. One, it being like a clear TPU, you can kind of see it's pretty prone to picking up fingerprints. I wish that wasn't the case. But the bigger issue that I have is that, like a lot of these cases, it covers up the buttons, all right? And that just means that it makes it harder to feel for the buttons and use a digital audio player without looking at it. And for me, that's a big reason I use a DAP, is I like to have buttons that I can use to operate the device without looking at it. And when you cover up the buttons like this, it makes it extra difficult. This one actually was kind of confusing to me too, because this here is a hole, which is actually going to have a button behind it, which is your power button. Yeah, anyway, it's a nicely built case. Obviously, it's very, very well built. The materials on it are quite nice and premium. So they didn't spare expenses on this thing. It's just by design, I'm not a really big fan of it. So, but that is it for the accessories. So let's dive into talking about the physical form factor on the R8 itself. And this thing is a unit, okay? Let me actually pull in for comparison. This is a Google Pixel 4 XL, all right? So 4 XL versus this thing, almost the same size. I believe the screen size on this guy is 5.9 inches, very large for a digital audio player, and resolution on it is actually really, really nice too. I will punch in on it so you can take a look, I suppose, although know that this is definitely not the best way to view a screen is through my camera. But yeah, really nice resolution. You know, decent refresh rate. I think it's probably your typical IPS display. So viewing angles on it are good. Colors are fantastic. It's actually one of the better looking screens I've seen on a digital audio player, if I'm honest. Apart from that, like it's got no bezels, which is nice. And well, okay, a little bit of a chin, but you know, quite small bezels all the way around. But that does not spare this thing from being very large in the hand otherwise. And as you can see, quite thick. Again, let's pull in that smartphone for a comparison. Not necessarily the fairest comparison because all DAPs are thicker than a phone, but just so you know, this thing is quite on the thick and chunky side. It's also quite weighty and heavy, as you might expect, because this thing has a 12,000 milliamp hour battery in it. Which is quite a lot. Now the build construction all the way around the sides here we have, I believe this is a stainless steel and it is colored blue. It comes in different colors, so if you don't want blue, you can get it in, I believe, a black, some other color maybe. But you can also get it in this blue, which I think actually looks pretty nice. I'm a big fan of it, although I will say because it is a stainless glossy design, it will be, you know, fingerprinty. You will, if you want to keep this thing nice and clean, be attacking it with a microfiber religiously, as I have been. But yeah, again, it just feels quite large in the hand. Let's talk about, I guess, the inputs and outputs. On the bottom is where you have your headphone jacks, and you've got 3.5 millimeter single-ended, 4.4 millimeter balance, which you don't have on that cheaper digital audio player. And over here on the right, you've got dedicated line outs. Now, what's kind of neat about these is that they each have their own volume memory. So if you're using one for headphones, the other for IMs, and the other for connecting to your stereo system, they all have their own volume memory so that you don't have to, you know, accidentally blast your ears off, which I actually think is a really nice touch. But yeah, I guess we'll go over the button configuration real quickly. Over here on the left side is where you have your standard volume rocker, volume up, volume down. Not too stand out there, although I guess I will mention briefly that there is no, because there's a volume rocker, there's no volume knob. And a lot of people like a volume knob on a digital audio player. I'm a little bit mixed. I think I generally prefer a knob for volume control. It just gives you a nice tactile experience, but in a player that you're putting in and out of your pocket, having a knob can be actually kind of a problem. You can inadvertently push it. Now that said, this is not the most pocketable device anyway, so maybe it would have been nice to have a knob. But over here on the right side, you've got your power button, and there is, as you can kind of see there, a little bit of an LED there that I have disabled. By default, I don't know why, Hiby just has this blue light that turns on, and they do that with a number of their devices. I believe even this cheaper one did that too. I'm not a big fan of that. I don't want lights on this thing, so I had that disabled. But if you do want a blue LED on the side of your digital audio player, well, they've got you covered there. And then the button configuration over here is actually a welcome departure. Well, I have a quibble, but there's also it is a welcome departure from what Hiby's been doing lately with a lot of their buttons, in that they have 3 distinct buttons for play, pause, next track, and previous track. With some of their newer players, they've been doing a confusing thing where the previous track button is like in its own island, and these 2 buttons are configured so it feels like a rocker, but then the play button is at the top of the rocker. It's weird, it's confusing. And thankfully, Hiby's not doing it here with the R8 Mark II. The one thing that is a little bit of a bummer here is that you can see there is a nubbin on the play button, but the nubbin is pretty, if I'm just feeling for it blind, it's kind of hard to feel. And because of that, I find that it just takes me a little bit longer than I like if I'm, again, using this player blind. I'm not looking at it and I want to operate the buttons. I just have to feel and like kind of double check. Is that the nubbin? that is the nub, and I'll hit the button and begin playing my music. I wish it was more distinct. I'll just say that, okay? But yeah, I don't know. Apart from it being, you know, quite thick, heavy, that's about as much to say about the physical form factor. I guess I will briefly mention that this thing can get a little bit warm, as you might expect of a large digital audio player like these. They typically can get warm. This doesn't get overly warm, but I did find, okay, this might sound weird, I sleep with a digital audio player. I listen to music while I'm sleeping, and because of that, I'll often have my DAP in bed under the covers. And this thing actually got uncomfortably warm, where I would actually wake up in the middle of the night, take it out. I couldn't sleep with this thing. So not the most sleepable digital audio player out there. But if that's not a use case for you, not going to be a problem, because it doesn't get that warm if it's not in under covers, I suppose. It gets a little bit warm. But yeah, that is it for the physical form factor. I guess we'll now get into talking about the usability, what this thing is like to live with. And maybe to start with, I'm actually gonna go over the specs, because these are both interesting and also not that remarkable. You go into the settings. This is using Android. I don't even think I mentioned that up front, but this is using Android. And because of that, we get this nice screen that shows us all the specs of this unit. It's using a Snapdragon 665, which is a nice processor for a digital audio player. Typically, I find that this is plenty of power to run Spotify, which is the most demanding app that I ever use on digital audio players. It doesn't run them quite as smooth as your average smartphone, but it runs it plenty smooth that I'm not going to complain about it. What's notable, though, is that you get actually the same processor in this thing, which costs a fraction of what this thing costs. It's the same processor, which is, again, good enough. What you don't get, or what's unique to this device, is the amount of RAM. This thing has 8 gigabytes of RAM. I believe the M300 has 3 gigabytes of RAM. Ostensibly, that'll have some impact in terms of multitasking. Now, again, I'm not doing a whole lot of multitasking on my DAPs. I'm just usually using power amp. And the RAM on the M300 is sufficient for my use cases. But if you find that you have more demanding use cases for a digital audio player, you'll probably appreciate that it has 8 gigabytes of RAM. It's also got 256 gigabytes of built-in storage, which is a lot more than you typically get with a digital audio player. A lot of the times, these things will come with like as little as 16 or 32 gigabytes of RAM, of ROM. But this just means that I don't even need to use a memory card. I can just sync my music library directly to this device, and that's actually kind of nice. Screen resolution, again, I said it's a little bit more than 1080p, and there's your battery size at 12,000 milliamp hours, which is a chonker of a battery. Obviously, it makes this thing heavy, but ostensibly it should contribute to better than average battery life. And well, am I going to talk about that now? Let's talk about the battery life, okay? It's good, but it's not standout like you might expect with a 12,000 milliamp hour battery. Hiby claims about 21 hours of playtime if you use just a standard 3.5 millimeter, and that's how I typically listen to this device. So about 21 hours, that's what they claim, and that seems to line up with my listening experience. So I was charging this thing every other day, which for me is good enough. But it's a 12,000 milliamp hour battery. I would love to see fantastic battery life, and I would just say that it's good enough. The other thing that's kind of a downside with that big 12,000 milliamp hour battery is that means when you're charging this thing, you're going to be charging it for a long time. This thing gets basically the same battery life, about 20 hours of playtime, 2,000 milliamp hour battery. So this thing charges just way faster than this thing does, and you get the same amount of battery life. Obviously, I guess the trade-off here is that you're getting that FPGA, very unique solution for the audio architecture. And you're also getting a lot more power output potential. This thing can output, let me pull up the stat real quick, 710 milliwatts of power on the 4.4. But that said, when you start using the 4.4 balanced and this thing has got high gain, it's even got like a turbo mode. It's also got a Class A amplifier mode that you can switch into. When you enable kind of all the bells and whistles, the battery life on this does drop down to 11 hours, which is, I know that doesn't sound that great, but given all the bells and whistles and stuff that you're turning on, 11 hours at the worst case scenario it's acceptable, but just kind of on the edge of acceptable. I would love to see an audio player with a big battery like this that has just got mega battery life. I want to charge this thing once a week, but no, I'm charging this thing every other day. Kind of a bummer. All right, other things to talk about functionality wise. So I mentioned that this thing does run Android. It is Android 12, which is a nice modern version of Android. And because of that, it runs all of the software that I want. This thing has the Google Play Store. I'll pull it up there so you can punch it on that so you can actually see what I'm trying to show you. It's got the Google Play Store on it, and that means that I can go in and basically just do all the customizations that I like to do for a digital audio player. The things I like to do, I like to install Niagara Launcher, which is the launcher that you see here, just nice and simple. Lets me have a nice clean home screen, which I dig. It lets me install Spotify, of course, but also PowerAmp, which is the app I end up using much more than the stock music app. The stock music app is okay. I'll show you a couple of quibbles I have with it and the reasons I don't use it. But I'm able to install PowerAmp, and that makes this thing fantastic as far as I'm concerned. I also installed this little utility. It's hard to see up here, but it is a battery life indicator that is this white bar. This thing's 100% full, so that's why it's just a solid white line. But I like that because that indicates my battery while I have this app running in a full screen mode, which means I can fill my screen with music playing, but also it means I can use this app pinning functionality, which means that I can use a password to protect everything else. I can use the app music without a password, but still password protect things like my email, Google Drive, and all that stuff. And on the topic of Google Drive, the last app that I install with this that I really like is an app called Drive Sync. And basically what this means is that I have my music library on Google Drive, and using this application, it will automatically sync my music library with Google Drive to the Hiby R8 II. And that's fantastic. So it does all those things, and it does them really, really quite well. In fact, I'll finally give you a quick tour of Spotify. This is a raw launch. I haven't had it in memory, so you can get a sense for how quickly it launches, but it runs Spotify quite well. You can see I'm scrolling it. Very happy with the performance on this device, its ability to run all the apps and softwares I want. This is everything I want in a digital audio player experience. The only downside is that I get all of that also here with the M300, which again costs $200 versus $2,000 here, literally a tenth of the price. So where you would, I guess, expect there to be some significant differences is in terms of the sound quality. So let's talk about what the M300, or not the M300, let's talk about what the R8 II sounds like. And it's got that FPGA in there doing unique things ostensibly with the sound, but I gotta be honest, this thing, I can't hear a difference between them, okay? And I'm not trying to be like a pain in the butt. I tried to hear the differences. In fact, when I was initially comparing this device with this device, again, my assumption going into this was, if I'm ever gonna hear a difference between DAPs, it's gonna be in this case, right? Because this thing has got an FPGA, this thing's got kind of an out-of-the-box mobile DAC. There's gotta be some significant sound differences. And so when I initially was comparing them, I was like, okay, maybe I do actually hear a little bit punchier, tighter bass going on over here with the R8. But like I typically do whenever I hear, when I feel like I hear a difference like this, I blind test myself as best I can to rule out any sort of preconceptions that are going into it, any way that I might be tricking myself. So I have an audio switcher. I got some cables, hooked it up, twisted them around in a way that I couldn't tell which was which. And I did that listening test again. And whatever that tightness in the bass that I was hearing over here, it disappeared into my blindness. I couldn't hear any difference between them. So as far as I'm concerned, these things sound the same, okay? There is, again, a volume output difference over here on the R8. This thing outputs more volume. And because of that, it's gonna drive more headphones, whereas this thing has just got your typical 3.5 millimeter connector. It's only got 110, 105 milliwatts of power, something like that. It's plenty for everything that I listen to most of the time, but when I went to CanJam in New York, this was the DAP that I was walking around with because I knew I was going to be running into headphones that would probably need more power than my typical mobile stuff. And also it's just loud there and I need more volume. So as a backup solution, it was very handy to have this much power in my back pocket. But for my day-to-day use, it's definitely overkill for sure. But it is nice to have. The other thing I'll say is that Noise floor performance on this guy is actually quite good. That's one of the other differences that I can commonly hear between digital audio players is sometimes one will have a little bit of a hiss, especially when I'm connecting it to the 4.4 millimeter balanced. It's very common. I would say most DAPs have some audible hiss that I can hear on my Campfire audio auras. This guy does not though. This thing is like dead silent, which is awesome. Now that's also true here of the M300, which is pretty impressive for a $200 audio player, I'll be honest. But it is at least nice to see that going up in price, I'm not sacrificing that dead silent noise floor performance. It's really quite well done over here. Anything else? Okay, there is one sound advantage to the M300. Okay, one thing that, or sorry, to the R8 that the M300 does not do. And let me demonstrate this briefly. If you go into the settings, and this is a new thing that Hiby is doing with their newer DAPs, they're not doing with the M300, but I have seen it on some of their others, is they are adding, where is it? Audio settings, parametric EQ, okay? This is system-wide parametric EQ. And if you're not familiar with what parametric EQ is, it's basically just superpowers for how well you can tune your headphones. And let me just kind of give you a demonstration, right? I love the execution here. They give you this little graph that shows you what you're doing. You can set your frequency between 30 hertz and up to 20,000 hertz. Doesn't quite go down to 20 hertz, which would be nice, but that's a fairly small quibble. But let's say I'm going to set in a bass shelf at around 120 hertz, give it a Q factor of, let's say, 0.8, and a gain of, give it a nice little 4 decibel bass shelf. This is like fantastic control, all right? If you're used to like a normal 10 band EQ, the control that you get with parametric EQ is just so much beyond what you can get with a 10 band. Like let's say you're listening to IM and in your ear, you can tell that there's like a frequency peak at around 10,000 hertz. You don't like that, you can go in here, make a little EQ filter at 10,000 hertz. We'll give it a pretty narrow Q factor, let's say of 3, and we will do a negative gain. And you can kind of see, oh, I'm doing a low shelf. I need to do a peaking filter. You can see that I can just cut right at exactly where that peak I'm hearing in my ear is. And what's awesome about the way that Hiby's done this execution is it's system-wide. So no matter if I'm using Hiby's stock music app or I'm using Power Amp or Spotify, or even if I'm using this thing as an external DAC for my computer, the parametric EQ applies, and that is phenomenal. Beyond even that, it's a little bit blown out here on the screen, I apologize, but they've actually even got options for importing an EQ profile. So you can create an EQ profile on SquigLink, import it into here, and just have parametric EQ everywhere you go, which I think is fantastic. And that is something that the M300 doesn't do. So that's something that you do get. It's expensive, $2,000 to get that. And they are, as far as I understand, also putting out some of their other cheaper DAPs, just not the M300. But that would be about the only difference. Yeah, so I don't know. Those are my thoughts here on the M300. This thing is a very good digital audio player. It's just a little bit on the large and chonky side, I suppose. Honestly, if I had to pick between these two, all right, if I had to pick between the M300 and the R8 and saving $1,800, it's kind of not hard for me. I'm just going to pick the M300 and save $1,800. I don't really get why this thing costs $1,800. I don't get kind of just the high-end flagship DAP market in general. So maybe I'm the wrong person to be reviewing this thing, but it doesn't sound different to my ears. It's bigger, it's chonkier. I actually prefer the smaller form factor of this. In fact, take the $1,800 out of the picture. If these things both cost the same, I'm still gonna take the M300. I don't care that it doesn't have balance. It's got plenty of power for all the stuff I listen to. And okay, I will miss the parametric EQ. That's a pretty cool feature here on the R8, but I don't know, it's a good DAP. It's just, it costs $2,000 and I don't quite get it. So I'm gonna give it 3 stars. If you want to check out the R8 Mark II, of course, I got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, and you find this video helpful, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get into the pitch.